Hey everyone, so today we're going to do a quick little study here, a couple different textures using some different techniques. So you can see we've got some base layers down. So on the bottom here, we're going to start with a granite and marble technique. I've got kind of a mottled background in and an off-white. There's some blues in there. There's a little bit of a warmer neutral in there. The first thing we're going to do is create a pretty light layer over the whole area. I've used a bit of medium to help it not dry on me. And I'm using almost pure white in this instance to go over all of it. So we want to increase the modeling in the background to create a foundation. So once you've got that down, you're going to want to find a brush that you can put a little bit of water into, one with a stiff bristle that will flick. So I've just dipped this in clean water and now I'm using it to kind of flick water onto that wet wash we just did. You let it stand for a minute so it has time to soak into that top wash, because what was underneath it was entirely dry. When you blot this up, it's going to pull up just the areas the water was at. So you can see it's created a nice variable wash across the whole area with some speckles in it. We're going to start working on the veining. So in marble, granite, things like that, the veins tend to kind of have a rhythm. They all flow across directions. So we're going to go from one corner to the other. You pick a research image to make sure it's a color tonality that you like. I'm just going to kind of make this one up. Don't have a research image in front of me. I like a little bit of a cool blue tone, a little bit of a neutral, and we'll put some grays in there for fun. So let your underlayers dry most of the way and almost entirely before you go over it. You can see this one's pretty dry. We've got that nice speckled background. I'm going to put down a clear layer of just medium to help my painting kind of blur and soften. This is sort of like in watercolor when you pre-soak a paper, right? Pulling this blue color through the veining, I'm letting it make some different widths and sizes, sometimes little, skipping and jumping so it's not perfect line work. Mix a little bit of my base color in and then feather out those edges and those sides to soften what these look like. We can always work up to more high contrast, but we're going to build some soft ones in first. Pick up a little bit of a purplish gray and build some shadows and hazes, some bruising kind of colors into the stone. Everything is still wet, so we're still blending wet on wet, but what we're blending into is actually clear, right? Because I used that medium as my base layer. Picking up this kind of reddish tone, which is going to stand out a lot, but I want to make sure that you can actually see what the veining techniques here are. And I've got a straight brush that I can kind of twist and turn to create a variable line weight. You don't want to have to apply too much pressure or you'll be kind of cutting into the layers underneath it. You want to be able to just sort of glide it over the top. Do that trick with the speckling of water on it again to soften up any areas that are a little hard or to add more randomness. You can keep going through this with lots of subtle little areas, lots of subtle washes and veinings and shadows, and really build up a complex background for your marble. Now anywhere it's gotten just a touch bright, you can mix kind of an intermediate color. I like to keep a little bit of that base color in my palette so that I can pull from it and then soften along edges of veining, or use it to blend over different areas or to pull out from them. Acrylic moves better with more paint. It doesn't move as well in a dry brushing unless you're going for that very soft kind of textured effect. Adding some stronger blue veins because ours have sort of settled into the underlayers, right? I'm just remembering that they're kind of all moving in the same direction. Keep your brush, your hand, everything moving along that rhythm when you are working on it. So we're going to jump up here and work on some wood grains. So the one on the left hand with the yellow background is actually going to be like new wood, and the one with the grayed out background base coat is going to be like an aged wood. So first thing we've done here is create kind of a variable wash in the background. This will end up with one of the techniques we're going to try today. This will end up being our highlight color, which is kind of funky, but think about it like watercolors. We're laying down highlight color first. So I'm adding a little bit of white to help make these lighten up and to give us more texture in that area. Now you want this background wash to be entirely dry before we go on to the next step. So take a moment here and we'll do it with a blow dryer. So we've come back, these are entirely dry. Yay. So when you start looking at painting wood of any type, I want you to get a reference image because it's got so many different colors in the background. I know we've kind of been over this before, but there's reds, there's greens, there's blues, there's all sorts of colors that are actually in wood tones that are not browns, I promise you. Also, the older a wood is, the more grayed out, sun bleached it kind of gets. So that's why we've chosen that gray for the highlight in the back of our aged one. So using a little less medium than I normally would, only because I'm trying to do stuff with water in case you don't have medium. But you want to make sure that this layer that's going on here goes down really wet. You have enough paint and enough water, medium, holding it together. It works much better with medium than it does with water, which you'll see. But we're doing this one with just water and trying to get paint down quickly and a solid kind of coat of it because we're going to go through and kind of carve it up to reveal what's underneath. So this is a fan brush that has some texture in it. You can see if I push through with it, it kind of pulls up like a brush texture. You can use it to make knots and whirls. This dried a little bit on me, and because I used water, you can see that the line that the brush makes is actually very fine. It kind of closes again because water moves more than medium, right? But we still see some of that texture pulled through, a way to fake that grain and have the yellow showing through. So on the worn in one, I'm going to do it with medium just so you can see the difference. So I'm going to create, you can see I added a bunch of medium to that has slow dry in it and also kind of thins it out, makes it hold its shape in a way that water is going to just kind of pool and puddle, wants to find level. Medium's much more your friend with techniques like this. Adding some purples, adding some blues into this, like it's a mix of a Van Dyke brown, a little white, and a little Prussian blue with a Payne's gray. So we're going to look at different textures. So that's a very soft brush, doesn't leave much texture at all. This is the same fan brush, and you can see it's pulled up so much better than it did on the other side, just because of the medium versus the water. So we've let both of those layers dry. You can now go in and add your higher contrast shadows and highlights. But we've got a nice beginning of texture to this that you're building on top of. This has gone a little red for me, so I'm going to do a quick wash over it with some greens to mute it down a bit. And then use a small brush, wood grain, much like marble, has a rhythm and a directionality to it that you want to make sure that you're maintaining with your brush. I'm using a pointed round here because I want some pretty fine points. That's one reason I like using that scratch up technique, which you could use something, you could even use like the edge of a palette knife, you could use a sculpting tool, you know, whatever to scratch up underneath. It doesn't have to be a paintbrush pushed backwards. But it's nice for scale versus painting. Sometimes we can't really get that really fine point in acrylics. It's hard to achieve that. So if you're painting, you know, worn wood in scale, that paintbrush technique, always keep your like grody, gross old paintbrushes because they are fantastic for things like this. They're great for dry brushing. They give you nice textures. So if you have those around, then you can just sort of use those to create smaller scale wood grain. I know this one's pretty big. So I'm adding in some shadows, adding in some highlights. Always keeping the grain moving, right? Over here I'm using a deep Prussian blue mixed with a little bit of Van Dyke brown for my deepest shadows. On the other side I'm using Van Dyke brown mixed with a little bit of ochre and sienna. So as you're moving through this, just try to keep remembering to add color, add dimension, reference your research image for what size the grain is. It's tempting to make it really, really big or too pronounced or sometimes not pronounced enough. So it all depends on what type of wood it is, what stain it's got on it, how much weather it's seen, how old is it. So I'm using a very fine brush to add just a couple of deeper shadow grain lines, almost like cracks in the board for this. Sorry for that highlight in the middle of it. There's one thing with acrylics, they have that bright sheen to them when you're using medium. I'll work on my lighting setup. So I'm using kind of a dry brush technique now to add some subtle shading and modeling to the board that isn't so line-based, not so linear. The grain over on our newish board is a little chunky for me, so I'm using some dry brushing and shading there to sort of block that one in. So since this one closed up a lot because we used water on it, I'm making sure to go back and add in some different depth and things. You can always do, you know, more brush work instead of using the tricks, like dragging through it. Might just save you a little bit of time and give you a foundation, but then I end up covering a lot of that anyway sometimes when I'm working over it like this to make it more exactly what I want. So I also want to show you that you can do kind of the reverse version of what we just did to do wood grain with a glazing technique. So I've built kind of a new section of board over here. It has a little bit of that gray in the background and our deepest shadows. And then using a lot of glazing medium, I'm going to apply thin washes over it. So this is going to be a lot more like your watercolor techniques. You have to wait to them to dry in between, which is frustrating sometimes. So you can see that it just like slowly sort of blends together. Those shadows looked really, really stark before, and then I've done a little white pass, then a little bit of a pass with different tones to build up the same textures and colors that we got in the other one. But it's all being done with a little bit of translucency because of the medium I'm using. So I'm able to work from dark to light. So it's just another way to get to a very similar result. I hope that these kind of help you start thinking about how you can use these different techniques, different things to build your textures and to be blending, even on a smaller scale or in some of your second story sunlight projects. Just always remember that you can blend a lot better if there's a little more paint on the palette or on the board. and that you can always just keep reworking the same areas. And you can definitely make them more translucent if that's helpful. I think that scattering, that spatter of water, is a good effect to use on anything that's a worn or weathered texture. And dry brushing also very helpful for weathered textures. All right, thank you.